this episode, I speak with Jonathan Pageau. He's a well-known thinker and icon carver who primarily explores symbolism and how it informs our worldview. I've been following his work for well over a year now, and I'm very fortunate that I got the opportunity to speak with him. So that I don't interrupt the conversation midway, I'll mention this episode's sponsor now. But if you'd like to skip to the beginning of the interview, you can jump ahead to the time on your screen. This episode is sponsored by Hook Sounds. At the center of many creative projects is the music. But as someone who creates online content, I know how difficult it can be to find high-quality music that doesn't belong to someone else. In the worst-case scenario, your content can be demonetized or even removed if you cross certain licensing boundaries. To address this problem, Hook Sounds provides access to a library of high-quality music. Everything from epic and serious, to playful and fun, to futuristic and lo-fi, and much more. For just under $15 a month, you get access to a premium subscription. All songs, sound effects, and even intros. There are no extra payments, you have unlimited downloads, and valid for life licenses. And with new music being added every week, you won't ever run out of creative options. Additionally, if you use the link in the description of this video, I'll get a small commission on any songs you purchase. It's a great way to support the channel, and you can also use the promo code Dylan10, that's DYLAN10, Dylan10, to get an extra 10% off any of the subscription deals. Lastly, all the music you hear in this video is a Hook Sounds production, and if you like the sound of any of them, I've included the details for each song in the description. And now we turn to my interview with Jonathan Pageau. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. So I actually want to start off with maybe a little bit of a different question, which is, do you ever get tired of talking about symbolism, or is it something that you find just endlessly fascinating?
The interviews help, because, if I'm doing videos, one of the problems that happens is I really don't like talking about things twice. Like I do tend to try to keep talking about different things, but that means that it's good to have these types of interviews because people don't just know what I'm talking about. So it's hard. Like, how do you talk to someone who's never heard about symbolism? So talking to people like you is actually great. I like it because it forces me to kind of reformulate it from the beginning. But no, I never get tired of talking about symbolism ultimately, because it's an indefinite, like there's a million things you could always talk about. There's no end to it.
Yeah, you speaking now reminds me of when I started learning to play the guitar. It's the one thing that has managed to keep me perpetually interested, because there's no end. There's always another technique or another song or another melody or another what could you say, muscle memory to build. And symbolism is maybe, it is much like that. I thought maybe we could start off with, I don't know if this is a simple question or not, but you often talk about the distinction between how we see the world today as modern people and how the ancient people would have viewed the world and the lens through which they would have observed things and perceived things. Would it be possible to pin down maybe the fundamental distinction between how we as modern people tend to view things as opposed to ancient people? Is there one core at the center that differentiates our perception from theirs?
Yeah, I think that the best way to understand it is there's a move away from the phenomenological point of view as being let's say the point of consciousness, towards a kind of abstracted scientific vision of understanding the world. And so I would say that although it was preparing itself before, the Copernican revolution is definitely the moment where things shift radically, not in terms of the way people think of it, in terms of just thinking of the causality of what turns around what, but rather the possibility of formulating a system in which man and Earth isn't the point of view. And so it's like projecting your mind into space and then imagining this like solar system or whatever, and then thinking that that is somehow more real than the sun coming up in the morning. So it's like it's a progressive transformation, but it's like that. I think that's one of the main places where the shift happens. And so I think that the technical scientific point of view brings us in this alienated space, especially as technology gets added to it. And so we start to think things like, that water is more H2O than it is wet, and refreshing. So we start to see things in their mechanical causes as being primary rather than the way in which they're meaningful to us as humans. And then you kind of see this weird deconstruction which happens as things move forward. So I would say that I hope that helps. Like I think that that's just a basic way to understand the difference between an integrated, point of view where the world is meaningful and we don't, let's say, we engage the world with meaning, and one which is technical and alienated.
Yeah, so we actually kind of embed ourselves in abstractions, right? And then we kind of forget that they're abstractions.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. It's super interesting because people don't realize that something like the solar system is an abstraction. You
Yeah.
cannot experience the solar system. There's absolutely no way a human being can experience the solar system. And so it's actually like it's an abstract model that we create and that we kind of hold in our mind. And there's nothing wrong with abstract models. It's just that if we see these abstract models and these, let's say, these levels of reality that we don't have access to from experience, if we see them as primary and more meaningful than the ones we have, that's when the problem happens. And it's almost like we actually live in an alienated reality. The same goes for microscopes and telescopes. It's like you look at something and you think that what you're seeing through the microscope is somehow more real than the orange that you're eating. And so yeah.
So what is the difference between one of these models that you describe, like an abstract model of something, and a symbol?
Well, and so it's not that scientific vision and these abstract models can't have symbolism to them.
Mhm.
It's mostly that the integrated or the phenomenological point of view, because it is focused on the way in which things come together towards their meaning, it ends up being more um, attuned to what we could call symbolic thinking. And so and that's the best way to understand what symbolic thinking is to understand that in order for any category to exist, it has to be patterned. It has to be pattern itself, and has to fit in a pattern, whether it's just unity and multiplicity, inside, outside. There are different ways in which you recognize things as having a center in terms of an identity, and then a limit in terms of its of how much it extends into the world, like these types of basic understandings. And so once we see that, then that would be the basis for symbolic thinking. And so we understand that the symbol is the manner in which multiplicity is joined together towards its meaning. And that's what the word symbol means. What the symbol means: two things thrown together. So we talk about symbol as being the place where two rivers meet, or we say the symbol of the apostles, in the sense that we have like the whole of Christian faith. Then we take these different elements we think are essential, we kind of gather them together, we compress them into a symbol, and then it's like we have a map, let's say, of what Christianity is. And so that's the way to understand symbolism.
So the modern abstraction is I'm reminded of a quote. I can't remember now who said it, but the line is that we confuse the signpost for the sign to where it's pointing. So we end up climbing up the signpost instead of going to where it points. Would that be kind of like what we're doing, as opposed to going into the town that the signpost is pointing us towards, and like walking through the town and smelling the smells and tasting the foods and seeing the people? We're kind of confusing that for the abstraction that we've created. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that could be a way of understanding it. I think that the biggest problem, is mostly, in some ways, to think that things take for granted that things exist, and then look at their mechanical causes, look at their physical causes, and think that we're somehow grasping, the manner in which things exist. And then what ends up happening in this weird materialist world that we live in is that it's not that symbolism doesn't continue to function. It's just that people pretend, like, just ignore it and pretend like it doesn't exist. They don't realize that even in terms of memory, like the manner in which you string events together is necessarily structured. You can't, events don't just happen without a structure. In order for you to cut out of this indefinite amounts of things happening a coherent reality, you do it unconsciously, but you have to structure them. And then it's like, if you ignore these structures, the structure of memory, the structure of attention, the structure of how it is that we recognize unity in multiplicity, and you pretend as if that's just kind of taken for granted, and then we just analyze the world. It worked for a while. It worked for a while. It made people very powerful. But then at some point, things start to look wonky if you go on that for too long. And I think that's the point where we're at. It's like, wait a minute, our societies aren't holding together. We don't have points of unity. We can't get along. We're fighting incessantly. Like we are arguing. We actually don't even live in the same reality. So, like in the United States, it seems like you have two parallel realities, and people look at the same events and they just simply do not see the same thing. And so there's an extent to which that can always be true, but it's like it's becoming more and more radical. And that's because there is a lack of understanding of symbolism, which is there's a lack of understanding that we need transcendent principles in order to gather us into attention. It's like, oh, so wait, that's what a king is for. So when I complain about like the fact that kings are just like symbolic and they don't have any political use and they don't seem to do anything, it's like, well, maybe you need something to unite your group together.
Yeah, and it's in a way the symbol does play that role. What you said about the way we string memory together is very interesting, and that there's a structure. Because I was just thinking, if you tell me to describe my life to you, I'm automatically going to go to my childhood, and I'm going to kind of proceed through the different kind of sections of life. And there's an order there that I use to string my memory together. And I think, a day ago, a week ago, a month ago, a year ago, and you segment things kind of, you mentioned unconsciously, but yeah, you do without even thinking about it. Chesterton had this, I'm actually curious, have you ever read Orthodoxy by G.K. Chesterton?
I've read, I would say, I don't know if I ever read all of it, but I did try to read all of it. I've read some of it.
Okay. Well, he's got this line, I think it's in Orthodoxy, where he says that there's two types of people that have dogmas and know it, and people that have dogmas and don't know it, right?
Yeah.
And I wonder if people are still I've heard people say that modern people are still as embedded in myths. It's just that the myths themselves have changed, and we label these myths as scientific descriptions of reality, but really you have a creation myth, a destruction myth. So would you say that modern people are still very much mythological?
Oh yeah, there's no way around it. Oh, there's no way around it. If the idea that the Big Bang isn't just some Vedantic description of the expansion of the the primal unity into multiplicity, it's like it's clearly what that is. And so it's like, this all these images that people use, and so even the environmental crisis we're in is just an apocalypticism. It's just a form of apocalypticism, whether it's justified or not. These things are just structured in terms of storytelling and myth. So I think people are definitely in the mythological world, and it's not that the myths have changed in some ways. It's rather that we live in certain myths and we take on certain characters in certain myths. And so, for example, a good example would be to say the modern world is a Promethean world. It's a world that has taken the role of Prometheus, or let's say the technical character that brings technique to the world and steals knowledge from the gods, without reverence, and then applies it to the world in order to increase its power. And so it's like that's our world. And some people have recognized it. It's like if you go to Rockefeller Center in New York, you'll notice that it's like, yeah, some of the modernists actually knew that that's what they were doing. And so I think that that's what we need to kind of understand. It's like there's an inevitability to this story, and it also leads to certain things. And so, it's like the idea that the Promethean myth leads to Prometheus his liver being eaten every day. It's like people are like, oh, it's horrible, it's so cruel and stupid, or whatever. What does it mean? Well, it means that you're in a cycle. You get caught in this cycle that just repeats itself because you're not directed and you're not attentive to something which pulls you forward or pulls you up. And so, it's like the fact that a technical modern world would lead to a world which is also driven by addictions. It's like those two things, you'd think those two things don't go together, but if you knew the story of Prometheus, you would realize that they do. And that, it's like the most technological media advancements are related to pornography and video games. It's like that's what leads the let's say media technology. And it's like these two things are related to each other. So
yeah, and in the case of an addiction to alcohol, it leads to a quite very real liver damage coincidence, consequence.
Yes.
So there's a negative consequence to being in a myth but not realizing you're being in a myth. And I was recently watching a sports game, and there's a few meme pages I follow on Instagram, and I think they like to poke fun at the fact that you use a lot of sports analogies. I myself work in corporate training, so I train a lot of people. I often find myself relying on sports analogies because they're almost like they're a kind of focused example where people are familiar with the rules that you can use to break down these ideas. And I was watching a sports game, and there was a moment of silence for the Queen's death. And it struck me how ritualistic that is, and how it really doesn't make sense in a purely materialistic worldview. A moment of silence for who, right?
Well, the Queen's
everybody
death was like a great revealer. Man, that revealed a lot about actually what people find important. And it kind of reminded the world that there is this deep symbolic ritual world that is still kind of there underneath, and once in a while it kind of pokes its head up and people are like, oh, it's like how is it that I watched I didn't myself, but I know some people, they're like, I found myself watching the Queen's funeral for like 3-4 hours. Like, really? That's super interesting.
Yeah, and it's all ritual. I mean, it's all the parade and the manner in which they do things, and it really doesn't make sense if you don't understand that things are embedded within this mythological structure. And it's almost like you say, it's always there, and it's there in our daily activities as well. Basic things like just how we greet people. But I think sometimes it manifests itself in a very direct and hard to ignore way. In the case of, like you mentioned, the Queen's death. Yeah, interesting. I'm curious, just about your Christian walk. Did your kind of love for symbolism emerge as a consequence of your Christian belief, or did it was the symbolism always there, and then you moved towards the Christian worldview? Where did the symbolism and the fascination kind of emerge for you?
Well, I think it happened, you could say, as a kind of, not a crisis, but let's say that moment in your 20s when you're trying to kind of make sense of the world and you're trying to understand it. You're in university and you're being challenged and you're being provoked. And so I think it was myself and my brother that we were kind of developing these ideas together. And I think that's what it was. It was like, okay, so now I'm an adult. I need to make sense of this. And I feel like a lot of it doesn't, let's say, or some of the things that I was told, or some of the ways that I was presented things just don't reach the level of depth that I need in order to hold on to this, right? And so, when you're in your 20s and you're reading philosophy and you're reading stories from other cultures, you're reading different spiritual systems that exist all over. It's like, well, this has to kind of come together. And I think that, sorry, for both of us, discovering symbolic thinking and in scripture, is seeing the patterns in scripture and starting to notice them, and then realizing just how powerful that was. It was so, and then let's say it led me in a different direction in terms of my Christianity, which is why I ultimately became Orthodox, because I felt like once you kind of understand the symbolic structure and the symbolic layer, then all of a sudden, the idea, for example, that I grew up with to a certain extent, which is that rituals are superstitious, rituals are idolatrous, this kind of thinking where everything has to be informal, everything has to be improvised as much as possible, and you have to avoid all appearance of hierarchy, all these things. It's like all these type of weird modern tropes, you could say, just went out the window. Like they just completely went out the window. And so it just became almost impossible for me to stay in that world. And so I discovered the church fathers and their own analogical symbolic thinking. And then I discovered the liturgy and iconography and the wonderful language that the Christian church developed in the first millennia. And so I was like, yeah, that's it, just all made sense.
And given that you and your brother were developing these ideas, when you came across the church fathers, did it feel like you struck gold?
Yeah, I would say, but it's not everywhere in the church fathers. For sure, I was attracted to certain church fathers more than others, those
Yeah.
that are more typological. And so it's like it's the typological approach and the mystagogical text that really struck me, because they're the ones that are saying, like, here's what this means in the Old Testament, here's what this means in the Old Testament related to Christ. And then reading St. Gregory of Nyssa's Life of Moses, I mean, that really was the cincher for me. It was just that text is so dense in terms of its capacity to create these deep analogies, between the Old and the New Testament. Yeah, so yeah, it's
Yeah.
great. Sorry.
No, great to hear. Well, I'm curious, since reality does, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but since reality does unfold in a series of a series of patterns, which we can then represent symbolically, what is the meta pattern? What is the pattern of patterns?
I mean, it's what's described in Genesis. That's the best. Let's say the best story in the Bible would be like the story of Christ, but only because it's a puzzle. It's an answer to a puzzle that is posed in the first chapter of the Bible in Genesis. And so the pattern is, a transcendent, infinite, and then in order for the world to exist, there has to be two opposites, heaven and earth. A world of actuality and a world of potential, very much the way that, some of the later Neoplatonists or even like Dante presents it. And then there's the places where those meet. There's the incarnational principle, let's say. So it's like it's heaven, earth, and then a point that joins it together. And then once that happens, the way it joins together, it looks like a mountain because it gathers multiplicity and potential into a point. And so you have heaven, you have earth, and then you have a mountain that comes up to a point. It's like, and then you have, a concentric element and an eccentric element, and an aspect going up, and an aspect coming down, an aspect going towards the center, an aspect going away from the center. It's like if you just have that, you've got it. Like that's the pattern. And so the pattern can represent itself in different ways. It can represent itself as a going down the mountain, coming up the mountain in terms of stories, or just going up. And so you can see it, as a fall and redemption. You can see it there's all kinds of ways in which you can understand it.
Mm.
But that's basically the pattern.
Is that pattern present in pretty much every pattern that we encounter, whether we want it to be there or not? That union of heaven and earth.
Yeah. There's no other way. So you could understand it like the meta pattern is a way the pattern joins with a particular. Like that's the meta pattern. And so it's like it's a self-same pattern. Like it's a pattern about how patterns fit with the world. Like that's why that's what makes it strange for people to understand. It's like it's not an arbitrary pattern. Like it's the pattern of how things exist. It's like there's a so you could think that you can see the pattern as a name. Sometimes it's represented that way. That might be an easier way to understand it. It's like it's a pointing. So you like imagine a finger coming down from heaven and says dog, and it's like, and then all the variability of dog is captured in that name. And so it's like there are millions of dogs and there are hundreds of species, but nonetheless, I can still see dog, and there still is a contained unity, within that. And so, but there's a hierarchy, and so it's like, is it a dog? And then there are margins to the pattern, and so within the pattern itself, so there are breeds, and then there are kind of a mutt. Like, why is a mutt? Why do mutts exist? Like, why is a mutt and not just another breed, right? So it's like, why do we have a wolf, but it's not a dog, but it's like a dog? It's like on the margin of, it's like a transition. It's and so all patterns have that reality to them. It's like they have a center, an identity. They have a movement. They have a kind of ideal that is invisible, that you can see as being the thing that joins it together, and then it has exceptions and margins and variability. So yeah, so I think anything you can recognize as having being, has that.
I went through, like many guys my age, I'm 27 now, but like many guys my age, I went through the new atheism phase, and a lot of guys are still there, and some of the guys are now finding themselves drawn to religion in many varieties. But then for me, I actually, in the interim, I was immersed in the world of, believe it or not, psychedelics. It's actually through one of those experiences where I had a experience of kind of seeing very much present meaning in front of me. I won't go into too much detail. And when I say this to people, some people get nervous because they think I'm about to say something like, psychedelics are the reason that I came to see the meaning in the world, and as a consequence, I came to eventually see God, and as a consequence, eventually came to know Christ, and so on and so forth. But I always say, for every one or two guys that went through that and got out, there's 8 or 9 guys that are still there, and many people I still know who are still stuck in that world.
Yeah.
I think in some ways the psychedelic kind of community, if I could use that word, they seem to me almost on the very fringe of full-on religion.
Yeah.
But in a way, and Paul van der Klee actually talks about this in one of his recent videos, he says it's actually more dangerous, this view, than the pure new atheism. Because at least the new atheist view, the person is kind of closed to things, and you know what they're closed to, so you can begin to understand why they see things that way. But it's almost like talking to a Hindu who says Christ is Lord, and they say, yes, he's one of many lords. It's this kind of dissolving of all the categories and accepting just everything, right?
Yeah.
And the mind is so open that I think it was Chesterton who said the point of opening your mind is like opening your mouth so that you can close it again on something solid. But that might take a long time, right? You might never get to that point. I know the psychedelic questions is a difficult one, and people are wrestling with it a lot these days. Do you see it as like a passing phase, or do you see it as something that in the next 10, 20 years is going to be a serious point of contention between people?
Yeah, the second one. I think it's going to increase, and it's something we're going to have to talk about and deal with. And so it's an ambiguous question. It's an ambiguous thing. Like you said, I've met now several people that have become Christian because of psychedelics, in the sense that they had an experience which overwhelmed them, and then it led them to God. and to the church. But I've also, like you said, met people who have become almost psychotic or seem to have lost it because of that overwhelming experience. So I think that it's an ambiguous thing, and it reflects the ambiguity of what I call this new re-enchantment. There's a kind of, because of the types of things that I talk about, the fact that people can listen, although there's still new atheists that think I'm just saying gibberish. But the fact that there's now an increasing amount of people that can listen to what I'm saying and they understand what I'm talking about, like, that is astounding to me. It's still astounding, because 20 years ago there was no one to talk to. Like, there was just no one I could talk about these things with without them thinking that I was just kind of weird or saying nonsense. And so there's this moment now through Jordan Peterson, John Vervaeke, but then there's other people. It's all kind of happening at the same time. It's really is like almost like a zeitgeist, right? A spirit of the time, that can understand that, but it has a light and a dark side to it. And so, because the re-enchantment means that religion's coming back, folks. Like, religion is coming back. There's no way around that at this point. Now the question is, what religion and what kind of religion is going to return? And so we can see the inklings of it kind of pushing back into the world. You have things like Burning Man. You have things like, kind of woke religion, you could say, or ideologically driven celebration and circumambulation. We have these almost kind of divine, like the worship of the drag queen, or like there are types of behaviors that are, kind of manifesting the need, like the desire that people have again. It's unconscious for religion to kind of flood back in. We saw a lot of religious tropes during COVID. Like, a lot of religious tropes were just kind of flooding back in. So it's just going to keep growing. And I think, but it's a lot of it's going to be very dark. But some of it, once in a while, it's actually making it possible, like opening the opportunity for people to then maybe see the light side of that, right? Which is a possibility of an integrated symbolic world, which is aimed towards the good. So I think that psychedelics is just one more facet of that, where it has the same effect, where most of the time seems to kind of lead people into exactly what you said, a kind of deconstruction, or, it's like but it's weird because it's always very contradictory, but this idea, like, everything goes, like, I'm a universalist, right? So I had, I've all religions have something, and therefore I'm nothing, right? Therefore I don't follow any religion, because secretly I'm saying that I'm above all of them. Like, it's like that. No one would say that, but that's what it ends up looking like. And so you see that it's like when I listen to some of the modern Terrence McKenna and Alan Watts and these kind of guys, and it's like that's what it feels like. There's a lot of what they're saying sounds like that. It's it's like I'm too good for these religions. It's like I have the. So I see a lot of that, but we'll see. Look, I've said many times what I think about psychedelics is that I think it's dangerous. And I don't think it's evil in itself. And I think that there, once in a while, it seems to definitely be something that manifests. It's participating in this thing, but it's dual, it's ambiguous. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think the ambiguity is the biggest problem. Is you really never know what you're gonna get. It's
also because people are attached to the psychedelics. This is the biggest problem. I would say, like, the biggest problem with psychedelics is the psychedelic, in the sense that people think that that's what spirituality is. And so I keep telling people, because if you listen to that guy, I forget his name, the guy who wrote about Eleusinian mysteries and all this stuff, like Jordan had him on his channel. He's like,
I know
we have the clue now. Like, we know that Soma was a psychedelic. We know that the drink that they had at the Eleusinian Mysteries was a psychedelic, and so we've got it. It's psychedelic. That's the key. And it's like, you know what? The Eleusinian Mysteries lasted 3 days, right? And it was like 3 days of heavy rituals. Probably you didn't eat. Probably you didn't sleep. It was like massively taxing and engaging on you. And if at the end of that, maybe there was some kind of psychedelic, it's like only a modern person would then look at that and say, well, we got the formula. This is it. This is the chemical formula for spirituality. This is the God formula. And so just take this pill, just take this mushroom, and you're going to have the same experience. And it's like, no. And it's the same with the shamans. Like, shamans were initiated, and there was like, they wouldn't just spread this stuff around. Like, they just didn't have tourists come and then initiate them into their shamanism. It was an excruciating process, probably a lifetime process. And if there was some psychedelic involved in that, you can't reduce it to that. Everything else is probably way more important than the substance that they would end up taking. Like you said, because it had to be directed, it had to be framed, it had to be brought in a line so that it would yield the fruits. Let's say if it was just ripping off the veil, then it would have you would have gotten all the discernment you need in order to be able to deal with what it is that you encounter. And that's why in the Christian tradition, like, those states are attained through prayer, through fasting, through through rigorous ascetic practices, because those ascetic practices make you what you need to be in order to encounter those realities. And so, yeah, I think it's probably the best way to understand it. That's probably with the biggest problem. So you go to you just get the pill and you take it, and it's like, yeah.
And there is a kind of synthetic role playing of the shaman figure that I used to notice when I would attend. I would go to festivals where people would take LSD, or they would take mushrooms or these things, and you'd meet a guy who's sitting alone in the corner, and he's dressed like a shaman. He talks deliberately in a certain way to try and, I don't know if he's trying to convey some kind of an image to you, or trying to kind of convince himself that he's there. But I mean, this guy, he, for all I know, could have grown up down the street from me, or he's from the city next door, and the closest thing he's gotten to full-blown shamanism is maybe some kind of side quest in a Skyrim, while playing Skyrim or some other video game. And it's almost like this desire to embody something that you don't really understand. And you think that you have, you kind of hinted at it, but you feel you have some kind of secret knowledge, this esoteric knowledge, really, that makes you unique. And I think it's a very risky thing to do, because you can very easily become inflated, and you can very easily fall into this sense of pride, and you almost, in a way, deny your humanity, deny your sin, because you need to appear to other people like you have everything together, and that you're all wise, and that you know everything, when in reality you absolutely don't.
Yeah.
And
it's hilarious, because if you read the ascetic fathers, they tell you, ignore all spiritual experiences. That's to say. And they're not saying you're not going to have some. They're saying, yeah, you'll have spiritual experiences. You have all the experiences. Ignore them. And it's like, that's the total opposite of the psychedelics guy. It's like the psychedelics guy is just like, oh, I had this religious experience, I had this vision. The ascetic fathers is like, yeah, visions, ignore them. Ignore your visions. And it's like, and it's weird, because it's like, nonetheless, these visions end up feeding the entire culture of the church, right? And so it's like, we have celebrations, we have moments where we celebrate the protection of the Mother of God, where someone fell into a trance and had a vision of the Mother of God, like holding a veil over the city. And so it's like, it's actually, the visions do end up feeding the whole culture. But in your experience, if you have a vision, ignore it.
Completely. It's almost like psychedelics are becoming the idol of our times, like the main idol. It's very interesting to say that the obsession with psychedelics themselves, somebody takes a drug, and then they have this experience, and then for a lot of people, that's not enough. They at some point, it's not that they're addicted, but they feel that they can't get there unless they take that substance again. So, that they had this incredible trip at one point, and then they feel, okay, I need to do this again. And then they end up almost, I would say, kind of justifying this use of the drug, and they almost idolize it. They lift it up as this perfect thing. And any problem that happens, it's not the drug, it's always me as the individual. And then what's interesting is that at that point, ritual kind of starts to sneak in, and you'll hear people say things like, the set and the setting are more important than the psychedelic itself,
Yeah.
which is, I I don't know if I should say this, but it, in a very weird way, it almost sounds like a step in the right direction.
Yeah.
Although
No,
you
you're
don't want to
right.
be going in on that path anyway, but it's that ritual element is there to try and facilitate the experience you're going to have, right? And I think that a lot of the people I've met, a lot of the people I've spoken to, um, they are they're easier to talk to in a sense than an atheist. In a way, it's easier for me to relate to them on a, I could say, on a symbolic level, because their mind, some part of their mind is more open to that, I would say. They're more willing to consider these possibilities because the things that they've seen, they feel that the world is so strange now that religion almost becomes a possibility again. But I think also a lot of people come into it and they have a very negative view of religion already, and then they take a psychedelic and they see that as an alternative. They don't see that as something pointing them, telling them, hey, hold on, there's something bigger here, you need to get out of this, you need to go back to the true thing. They see the psychedelic as, oh, this is the thing, this is basically the god that I should be worshiping. And so they'll talk about it like a god, right? They'll say you have to respect the plant, and you have to, in a sense, venerate the psychedelic. Yeah, I'm curious what you think of that.
Yeah, there's I think what you've described is perfectly right. And it's also, you could say, it's like, why are we talking about mushrooms for a very long time? Why? I mean, I don't that's fine. It's like, but it's weird. It's like, I'm talking about, why am I talking about mushrooms in a space where I'm talking about the meaning of life? Like, why am I
Mm.
talking about that? So it's like, I mean, I'm not saying that it's completely irrelevant to talk about the means by which, let's say, you kind of reach places, but you know, if how can I say this? It's like, if I'm going to visit my family, I don't talk about the car all the time. Like, I talk about visiting my family. And so it's when you have these weird moments where someone's just, all they're talking about is the car. You're like, what's going on? Like, why are we talking about this for long amounts of time? So,
Yeah.
and I remember it's one of the things that hit me. It's one of the reasons why I never really took drugs when I was even a teenager, was I would be with my friends and they would just talk about pot, and they would just talk about pot
Mhm.
for hours. And then it was
Yeah.
like, they had these like secret little pouches, and like little secret, they had like little containers, and they had like aestheticized their pot use and like
Mm.
ritualized it. And it was like, this is ridiculous, folks. Like, what are we doing? Like, what is this? I
Yeah.
find this very uninteresting. It's all very uninteresting. So, yeah, I feel a little bit the same in terms of the psychedelics.
Maybe we could go to a simple question, but in your mind, what is okay? This is not a simple question. What is the relationship between consciousness and reality?
Um, so I think I need to say and very importantly, that the word consciousness is a modern. It's a word. I don't know what its origin is, but it's definitely not a word that's used by the church fathers. It's not a word that is yeah, that is used in the Christian tradition so much. But
Yeah.
it's okay. It's an okay word. It's fine. Uh, the best way to understand it, in my opinion, is it has to do with attention,
Mm.
right? It has to do with what John Vervaeke calls relevance realization. And so the problem is, again, the problem of multiplicity. It's like, how do we background and foreground things? How do we know that they're relevant enough to see, and not just in terms of your eyes, but to like perceive? And then we attend. And so attention is, you could say, the world is made of attention. Maybe a good way to understand that attention is one of the elements that coagulates multiplicities into identities. um and so maybe that's the best way to understand it. And so It's like the world could be cut up, and you can understand, like, on a purely quantified level, the world could be cut up in an indefinite amount of ways, but it's not. It's cut up in certain ways, and those have to do with what we attend to, has to do with what we care about. It has to do with what we're capable of being conscious of, you could say. And so then the attention and the relevance, realizing what is relevant, so that I can formulate categories, both propositionally, but also just in terms of grabbing things and engaging with things, and knowing that it's like, oh, I'm grabbing that's a hammer, like I'm going to use it to do this. I'm walking on something which is solid, and then I see there's water, and I don't walk on that. And so it's like, that's what I mean. It's like, it's not just an abstract mental thing, it's an actual realizing of what is relevant and what is meaningful, and in what way, as I engage with the world. And so that is where symbolism comes from. So the symbolism of water has very little to do with its physical characteristics in terms of what molecules constitute it, but it has everything to do with the fact that you drink water, you can drown in water, you bathe in water. Water comes from above, and then there's salt water below. It's like, this is what constitutes the symbolism of water. And if you ignore that, and you think that water is just a bunch of molecules, you will die. It's as simple as that. You will die. You will die because you're not drinking it. You will die because you drown in it. Like, whatever it is, you're going to die if you don't live in the symbolic world. So, yeah. So that's the relationship, I think.
No, great answer. Great answer. The water analogy is great, because it's also like, you can't see things as just a bunch of, I want to use the word things again, but I don't walk into
components, like a bunch of components that constitute something. And then you just cannot. It doesn't. The world doesn't work that way.
Yeah, and we don't experience it that way at all.
Yeah.
And the way we experience it, and I would say also the way. Okay, well, maybe this is another question I could ask you. So when somebody looks at a situation and they frame it differently, so I don't know where I heard it, but, and I'm so careful these days to say there was a study that said this, or there was a study that said that, but just bear with me. Apparently there was a study where they went to Olympic athletes who had won bronze, silver, and gold medals, and they tried to figure out which one had the most regret. And you would maybe think the bronze medalist, because they came in third place, but they've actually found it was the silver medalist, because the silver medalist, the way they framed the situation is that they were so close to the goal. They were so close to being number one, but they didn't reach it. And the gold medalist is obviously just happy that they won. And the bronze medalist, he's just happy that he had a place on the podium, right? He's just happy that he got to be up there at all. And so I'm curious, especially with the recent rise of, Stoicism. And I know John Vervaeke talks about this a lot in his, when he talks about the meaning crisis, and Stoicism is kind of one of these reemergences as a consequence of, I hope I'm not misrepresenting what he said, but just off of the top of my head, Stoicism is kind of emerging, and this idea of, the way I perceive things can actually change the way I feel about things, which actually, as a consequence, changes the way I experience reality. And I think that's true. I think if you view water as a set of components making up something, and then you view it, as you've said, in the symbolic sense, that's obviously going to change the way you perceive things, and as a consequence going to change the way you feel about the world and the way you experience reality. So our framing, our conceptual system, and reality, I don't think you can find a clear line between the two. Is that a fair thing to say?
No, I think you're right. I think you can't, especially if you understand the what I proposed at the outset, which is the inevitability of attention and relevance in the problem of how things exist. And so we're not talking about the material causes of things when we're talking about that. It's like, we're not also denying them. We're not saying that it's all the magical worlds, of imagination. The world has, let's say, the world as we experience it has certain constituents, and those, it doesn't deny any of the scientific realities that people discover. But but it's contained within the symbolic world. It's necessarily because the humans care for a definite amount of things, and in a hierarchy. And so it's like humans, how can I say this? A good way to explain it would be humans can care about NASA, taking pictures of deep space. They can care about that, but they better care about that less than they care about eating and sleeping, because you'll die again. Like, there's a hierarchy of care, and that hierarchy of care manifests itself constantly. And so the same would be like, even in terms of scientific research. So you can research things like that, for example, like what stars are made of, and humans can care about that. But if you do that and then you stop like doing research that is about what humans care about in the most immediate way, then you're going to break everything. Things are going to break, and people are going to revolt, And so it's like there's just a normal hierarchy of care that people ignore. It's just about getting back into your body and realizing the world you really live in, and realizing that I can believe that the earth revolves around the sun, but it's more important that the sun comes up in the morning, because that organizes my day, and it organizes all of society. And people are, most people are awake during the day and most people sleep at night, and that's basically the pattern of everybody and everything that functions in the world. And so if you mock, if you say something like, it's an illusion, right? The sun coming up in the morning is an illusion. What's really true is that the earth, the earth is turning on itself, or that the earth rotates around the sun, or whatever. Like, the precession of the sun in the sky in terms of seasons, it's an illusion, right? All of this type of thinking, this is where people fall into nihilism, and where they don't realize the world they live in. They just don't realize that you can say that as much as you want, but you can't stop the fact that that the sun, coming up in the morning and going down at night manages your world, everything about it. So,
well said. And I was one of my, I would say, one of the experiences I went through that really led to my conversion was actually walking in the garden with my mom, and she'd been going through a very rough time at the time. This is a few years back, about, I think, 6 or 7 years back, and I was kind of I don't know what you'd say, the new age guy who went to Cambodia and came back and thought he understood Zen and was reading McKenna and reading Watts, and I was very much within that whole world. And I just saw suffering. I saw my mom going through a very rough time, and my whole worldview just collapsed right in front of me in that moment. I just realized that saying to her in that moment, I didn't say it, but it was on my mind, wanting to say to her, all this suffering, all this pain, it's all just an illusion. In that moment, I just realized how phony, how superficial, how flat, how nihilistic that actually is, because it's almost like you don't have to care about anything really. And I still cringe a little bit when I hear people say, well, everything's just an illusion. I say, okay, but now what, right? Where do we go from here? What's the point of doing anything if everything's an illusion? If all the suffering, all the ambition I feel is just, I mean, I think when people
immediately slap someone in the face when they say that, like right away, just slap them really hard in the face, and then to just smile. All right, carry on then, Mr. Illusion. It's like,
yes. Well, yeah. I mean, it's like people who say, I don't have a moral problem with stealing, and then they get robbed, right? And then you realize they actually do have a pretty big problem with theft, right?
But I can tell you, like, I can give you the trick, like if you want to understand the new atheist trick, or like the materialist trick, the nihilist trick, it's very simple, and it doesn't take much once you understand it. All you have to do is reduce a united being to its components, and you don't have to do it. You have to do just one level, right? So someone says something is meaningful, and then you say, oh, that's just like a human being is just, a bunch of chemicals that a bag of chemicals, So what you do, and so the funny thing is that a bag of chemicals is also an identity, they all those things, the elements also have identities, because there's a hierarchy of that. But that's, if you want to understand, people do it all the time. They'll say something like, it's like, whatever it is that you're doing that's meaningful, they'll just reduce it to its elements. It's like shaking hands. What, you just touch people? We just touch our hands together. That's what we're doing. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous to touch our hands. What are we doing, right? So you can do that for anything that has meaning. But then the trick, and this is the trick, is that all the elements you bring it down to are also meaningful and symbolic and ritualized. And so you would have to like go all the way down, right? It's like you could always say about everything, oh, it's just a quantum field or whatever. It's just a field of possibility. Everything's just a field of possibility. But usually you can just do it one step. So it's like, if you really want to be Mr. Cynical, that's all you need to do, is just reduce. You just have to reduce it to its elements, right? It's like a story in the Bible. Some guy gets nailed to a cross, he dies, and he comes back to life. Like, that's it. That's your religion. Seriously. It's ridiculous, right? And you can do it with anything. It's great. It's a beautiful, it's like a trick. But once you see that that's what happens, it's like you won't fall for it ever again when somebody tries to reduce something to its elements.
Yeah, well, as you were saying that, I mean, you mentioned people can do it with anything. It's almost like a good example of how it kind of injects nihilism into things is, supposing I come to you and I've had a really rough week at work and it's Friday and I'm in a good mood because it's Friday and I think, yes, the weekend's coming up. I've got Saturday, I've got Sunday. Aren't you glad it's Friday? And you say to me, well, look, in 3 days it's Monday. Or I come to you in December and I say, I'm so glad it's December. And you say, yeah, but guess what next month is? And it's, in a way, to me, it strikes me as the same thing as to what you're describing. It's in a way reducing things to components. Well, okay, what really does Friday mean, since it's just another arbitrary point.
It's just a convention. Yeah, it's just a convention of time that we've imposed on ourselves. And it's just funny. Yeah, like I said, it's hilarious. Neil deGrasse Tyson does that all the time. That's like, it's basically his one move. His one move is to say something like, there's absolutely nothing special about December 25th. It's not even the solstice. It's like a few days after the solstice. It has no, like, there's no geographic, thing happening in the sky that could explain the significance of that day. It's just another day, basically. So you can do that, and he does it constantly. It's hilarious.
I think now that you've revealed it, I'm probably going to start noticing it a lot more. I don't know.
Yeah, pay attention to him in particular. He's the, I don't know if he's still kind of online much, but like, if you look at his tweets and look at his posts, you'll see that he does it constantly. He just reduces something to its elements and then declares it to be non-meaningful.
Wow. So when you wake up in the morning and you get out of bed and you open the blinds and you see the sun shining, do you find in yourself this tendency to materialize things or to reduce them down, or is it kind of like an active mental effort you have to put in to try and see things symbolically, or does it get better as time goes on? Is it almost like a habit, or is it more like a switch that goes off?
What you thinking symbolically, you mean?
Yeah,
I don't know. I don't totally know. Like, yeah, I don't totally know why it is that, like, let's say, we're able to think this way. It's something that happened to us in some ways. It's not necessarily. It's also a product of our time. Thinking symbolically is not. In some ways, it's a sign that we're in a bad place, because in the normal world, you don't have to think symbolically at all. You just exist. The fact that we think symbolically is actually a sign of alienation. That the seeing symbolism is a sign of alienation. And so it's like, you don't talk about what it means to shake hands. You just shake hands. You don't explain to people why you would have to sit around the table and eat together, because it has this symbolic element, or why you should participate in this and that religious ritual, because it brings together the different elements towards one. Usually you would just do that. It would be intuitive. You wouldn't have to explain it. And so the fact that let's say I'm explaining it, means that I actually live in a form of alienation. Like I am alienated, and I'm actually kind of using that alienation against itself, where it's like I'm alienated enough to then look back and see the pattern and say, okay, wait a minute, but this is actually meaningful. Like this is actually meaningful. But this helps people to understand also why, because often people tell me, like, why don't the church fathers explain symbolism? Why don't they talk about symbolism? And I'm like, they didn't have to explain it. They just had to exist in it. All they did, so they did typology. They would create analogies between, different aspects of the world, but they didn't explain the typologies, and they didn't have to break it down for people who didn't live in that world anymore. But like, sadly, that's what we have to do. So in some ways, I think it's also important to understand that in some ways, even what I'm doing is from somewhat of an alienated position. And so it's like, it's hard. Let's say it's not natural for me to like go to church. It's an effort, right? It's not something that just comes naturally and like participate in the liturgy. I enjoy it, and I find great joy and meaning and purpose in it, but it's not something that just kind of flows. I am more modern, and most people are more modern than that. So
Yeah, it kind of makes me think of, if I tell you a joke, and then as I tell you the joke, I start explaining the joke. And it's through the explanation and the analysis of the joke that I actually remove all the humor from it. And then, you don't laugh, as opposed to me just telling you the joke and you laugh, right? It's that difference between, or playing a board game, and, as we're playing, I'm talking about the guy who created the board game and his history, and it's kind of irrelevant to the game we're playing, right? The point is to be immersed in it. So that's an interesting point to me, because I think sometimes you'll watch these, especially your content, there's almost a sense that I think I'm doing something wrong. Like, I should be seeing the world in a specific way, and if I could just do that, then things, I'd feel different, or I'd experience things in a more joyous way. But really, it's not about analyzing the world and trying to get into something. It's really just about going about your life. I hate to say it, but it sounds a lot like, before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water.
yeah, something like that. Yeah, that sounds fine. But it's okay to have a bridge. Like, I think that in
Yeah.
some ways, let's say what I'm trying to do is kind of jumpstart something, right? It's like you got a motor that needs to be jump started, and then once it gets going, then at some point you hope that people will be more involved and engaged. But so yeah, so it's not completely useless. Of course not. If it was completely useless, I wouldn't do it. I think it is useful, and I think that, so one of the things that I try to do, let's say, is try to try to provoke insight in people. Like, that's something that's
Yeah.
real. So if I can connect things together in a way that you didn't expect, like I can surprise you with a connection, and once you see the connection, it's true, right? You can't go back. You can't think the way you did before. You hadn't seen it until it was shown to you, and then when you see it, it's like, yeah, there's no way that I can deny this now that I've seen it. And so I think that those insight moments are important and useful for people to jumpstart the symbolic machine, you could say, and now realize, wait a minute, no, like, actually the world is pattern and the world is meaningful. And so, yeah, so that is something I think that you can do in terms of symbolism, that is almost more useful than explaining the way symbolism works, is actually causing insight. And so in some ways art does that, and can do that if it's well done too. So
Yeah, I'm actually reminded of a quote about, the Greeks couldn't see the trees for the dryads, or, the naturalist talks about the bush and the brook, but the supernaturalist talks about the god of the bush, the god of the brook, and the god of the bush. And it's almost like you need to discuss these points, like you say, to get things started. But hopefully one day, you won't need to necessarily be conscious about it. And I think a lot of it comes down to the way that people pass on this knowledge to their children. And I think people actually actively need to maybe not speak in, I don't know, purely symbolic terms, but definitely avoid reducing things down constantly. I
Oh
think that's
yeah, for
probably
sure.
the first step, right?
That's
And
a
then,
huge, yeah, no, that's a huge thing. And then also understand the value of symbolic living, and so therefore at least engage in the type of symbolic living that is the most immediate to you. Like a simple example is, at least here in North America, we've come to a point where people don't eat together, families don't eat together, and so they have all these different schedules and everything, and so they just don't sit together every day to have a meal. And it's like, yeah, your family won't survive. You can't survive as one if you don't have ritualized and, let's say, encounters between the people that are supposed to constitute the unity. And so
mm,
you that actually has to happen. And so people can understand, it's like, what, I'm going to be deliberate about this, right? I'm going to have family meals every day, because without them, that basic pattern, it's more important than resolving your conflicts. Like having a family meal every day has more value than like trying to fix some specific thing in your marriage or in your family. And so hopefully, yeah, so hopefully things like symbolic thinking or symbolic intuition will help people see that these types of activities are worth investing in.
yeah, I think that's a great point to end on, Jonathan. Thank you so much for your time.